Who would have thought a couple of weeks ago that we'd be in this predicament? I never thought I'd be preaching to an audience of one and a camera. I never thought about a pandemic. I never thought about the earthquake. I never thought about the swarm of locusts. When you read the news and see the news right now, it's unsettling. Facing the storms of life can be hard. And we need to remember and understand that we have been equipped by our good God how to handle these times. This lesson is about becoming unsinkable in the storms of life. The problem with the storms of life is they aren't serene, they aren't peaceful, they're unsettling, much like a wave that's about to take over a boat. When we are trying to become unsinkable, it's important for us to remember to read our Bibles and to ponder them. We're going to start by reading 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. Follow along with me. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. While discussing his ministry with the Corinthian church, Paul details a mindset, and sometimes I wonder if he wasn't even preaching to himself. The struggles that he had, as evidenced a few chapters later in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, they're just mind-bending. And there are some situations where our strength and our resources, like this resource of videotaping, or maybe even our personality can overwhelm a problem. Maybe by our strength we can do it, but did you hear in verse 7 what he said? This treasure, this gospel, this goodness that we understand is housed in jars of clay. Those jars of clay are us. Easily breakable, easily anxious, easily troubled. But the power that overcomes is the power of God, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We don't overcome anything without the power of God. The things that we are going through as a nation, the things we're going through as a community, the things we're going through in a family are unsettling and unnerving because they're not normal. And these are the times that we particularly need to focus on God. Paul was going through his storm. He had many things that bothered him, like he says in chapter 11. The things that come upon me daily, my deep concern for the churches. The elders of this church, the elders of other churches, Christians all over the world are unnerved and unsettled right now. But remember, the things that he talks about in chapter 11, they would be even more unnerving than anything that we're going through right now. Paul faced his fair share of storms. But what he does in this teaching, what the Holy Spirit does for us in this teaching is he gives us a mindset. He gives us an attitude to remember to go to in our storms. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, later in the chapter beginning in verse 16, he said, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For our light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but the things which are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient. The things that are unseen are eternal." God can change the circumstances if He wants to. But what is true, what is apparently true, and what has always been true is He doesn't always change our circumstances. Sometimes He expects us to trust in Him. It's important for us to allow His presence and His Word to change the way that we think. It's important for us not to be so fixed on this moment. Even if it's a moment of affliction, even if it's a moment of affliction and persecution and trouble. Did you hear what he said? This light momentary affliction. Now, how many of us could read through chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians and call any of the things that he had gone through light or momentary? Those would be the things that would leave scars, physical scars. The people in Corinth could imagine the scars that were on Paul's body because of the physical things that he went through. But what we have come to appreciate now in the 21st century is sometimes physical scars are a lot easier to handle than emotional scars. Even these emotional scars of what happened to him and the anxiety that came from them. How many of us right now are dealing with our emotions in a way that we understand and we certainly want God, please change my circumstances, but God doesn't always say yes, even to His faithful. Sometimes He says, trust me. Paul still looked like a beat up man, and he was beat up because of the gospel. Did you hear his soaring faith, though? For our light, momentary affliction is working for us. It's working for us. Now, one of the things that can happen is we can do a few things in the storm. We can deny that anything is going to happen to me. Well, it's not going to happen to me, therefore it doesn't matter. Well, that's foolish and not very neighborly, especially right now. We can walk around saying, I'm going to live my life and I don't care about anybody else. Well, certainly that's not Christian. I'm going to live my life regardless of the circumstances. That kind of flippant attitude is probably not the best way to look at a storm. Those are the type of people who see the funnel cloud and run to it because it's cool. We can curse the fact that it might happen to me or it has happened to me. Could you imagine how many times the temptation would have been for Paul to wonder, is this worth it? Well, his faith helped him understand that it was worth it. Now, we could be kind of the ones who don't deal with it very much and just say, well, I'm just going to ride it out come what may. Well, that may help for a little while, but that's not really going to help in the long term. We can even become so afraid of the storm that we hide in fear. We hide in fear and we refuse to help even our neighbor. And we may try to rationalize our fear and our hiding and not even help a neighbor who is right next to us or some family who needs something. Or we might think, well, somebody else will help them or the government will help them when we have as many opportunities as we can to help. Waiting for somebody else to fill a need that we can fill or we might have the opportunity to fill is certainly not Christian. Something else that we can do, and it's more biblical, is we can prepare to act based on our faith, based on the presence of God, based on the Word of God, and use the sound judgment that He blesses us with in this good, faithful attitude of becoming unsinkable. Becoming unsinkable is what Christians need to do. It's what we need to be shooting for. Because Satan always wants to sink us. There are times and situations that you just end up breathless. You end up alone in your thoughts and with your faith, and you wonder, how can I do this? No matter the severity of the storm, God has called us to become unsinkable. We're going to consider two examples right now of people who became unsinkable, who God made to be unsinkable. Now, when you look back through the Old Testament and you look even through the New Testament, God's people have been through some mighty big storms. I know this storm now has caused anxiety, it's caused fear, it's caused panic, people fighting over toilet paper. I hope we look back on this and laugh. I'm not sure I will. When compared to some of the storms that God's people have been through, I think about the three prophets during the Babylonian captivity and exile. When I think about Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, I'm amazed at them and the storms that they were going through. Think about them. Read about them. Read about how Jeremiah was treated. Read what Ezekiel had to put up with. Read what Daniel went through during those times. Those were people who were in a storm, and it wasn't a momentary storm. It was for most of their life. Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel are just three of a great many people, but I'd like to talk more specifically about some folks not in the captivity, but the first one I'd like to talk with you about, of course, with a storm, is Noah. Noah was called by God, and according to God's grace, He called him to build a huge vessel to house the remnants of creation that would inhabit the earth after a flood, a mighty storm. What God told Noah was going to happen had never happened before and has never happened since. And Noah trusted in the Lord. But what's so very important about the story of Noah is that God made Noah unsinkable. He gave him the tools, He gave him the situation, He gave him this opportunity by His grace so that Noah and 7 others were saved, as well as all of the animals that we have now are descendants from those animals that came out of that ark. It was because of God, but it was also because Noah trusted God. Noah trusted God and went through. Have you ever let your mind wander? Because the Genesis account says it took him 100 years to build. How did he do it? What must his neighbors have thought? I wonder if his wife ever thought he was an idiot. I don't know. These are all questions. These are all situations. But in this specific example, Noah was called by God. Noah trusted in God so that he quite literally became unsinkable. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is a passage in Matthew chapter 14, where Peter and the rest of the disciples were in a boat after Jesus had prayed. And in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the night, many of you have heard me use this before, but Peter, after quite a fright, was called by Jesus in the middle of this situation, after they thought he was a ghost, after the mind-bending situation that they're in. Peter is called by Jesus to walk to him, to quite literally become unsinkable. To Peter's credit, he gets out of the boat. Peter had never walked on water before, but he'd been around water all of his life. After all, he was a fisherman, and he knew what water could do. And he knew the perils of being in a storm. But he had faith to become unsinkable. But you see, what made him unsinkable was not his faith. What made him unsinkable was the power of God working with his faith. The power of God and the fellowship that he had with God at that moment. When he kept his eyes on Jesus, Peter became unsinkable. He trusted in the Lord and he walked on the water. That's an amazing thing to behold. And I wonder what everybody back in the boat was thinking while he was walking on the water. Now we all know the rest of the story in Matthew 14, 22 to 33. The wind and the waves got Peter's attention, and he turned his focus off of Jesus, and he began to sink. You know, just between you and me, when God suspends the laws of physics, He can do it however He wants. But I don't just begin to sink when I jump off of a boat. If you jump off of a pier, if you jump into a lake, if you jump into a pool, you don't begin to sink, you sink. And I think it's interesting that Matthew says, and he began to sink. He began to sink, and he knew he was helpless. And he cries out to the Lord, "Save me." And the Lord saves him, even with the discipline of calling him of little faith. But Peter trusted in the Lord and was unsinkable. Becoming unsinkable like Noah and Peter and the exile prophets is important. The first thing we need to understand, God has been proactive before any storm that we have ever faced. whether it was the storm of the Babylonian captivity, whether it was the storm of Genesis chapter 6, whether it was the storm of Matthew chapter 8 when Jesus was asleep in the boat, or it is the storm of Matthew chapter 14 when Jesus was walking on the water to them. God is proactive before the storm. That is something, brothers and sisters and friends, that we have to understand. God has provided a way even in the midst of the storm. Now, here's a little theology lesson. We don't need to know whether the storm is from God or our adversary, because God can cause a storm. God caused the captivity because of judgment on Israel. But sometimes our adversary will use situations and turmoil. We don't need to know whether the storm is from, because the storm is the storm. Sometimes we want to know too much about why and why and why. Well, sometimes those questions will never be answered. And instead of letting it afflict us, let's go to what fixes it. And what fixes us in a storm is God. No matter if He's judging us, or no matter if our adversary is using this time and situation and tribulation to cause us to want to fail. We don't need to know whether the storm is from God or our adversary. We need to become unsinkable, we must have a complete trust in God. A complete trust. We're not going this alone. I wonder, when we felt all alone in the past, I wonder where that thought has come from. It's interesting in Psalm 22, after the psalmist says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" If you'll read through that psalm sometime. When you read through that psalm, David wasn't alone, and he came to realize that later. There are times that we're going to feel alone. But when we realize in faith that our God's presence is always with us, "I will never leave you nor forsake you," He promises that to us. We don't have to go it alone. And what's even better is if you're a child of His, we have people, we have His church, so that we don't have to go it alone. And we certainly shouldn't be following our own path. He's given us a path to follow. He's shown us the path before the storm. He gave Noah the tools. He showed Noah how to do this. When Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he was walking on water. Our complete trust in God is so important for us to become unsinkable. But of course, we have to trust in God enough that we have to do what we're told. By faith, Noah built an ark, Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Matthew walked on water. By faith, Daniel trusted during the captivity. By faith, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted in the Lord. They trusted in the Lord who was going to be with them and for them, regardless of the outcome. Now, our stories don't always end up like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sometimes our stories end up like the end of Hebrews chapter 11, where folks died because of their faith. Regardless of the outcome, we need to do what we're told. That following of Noah, of Matthew, what God asks of us in becoming unsinkable, that following required them to overcome their fears and to set out to follow the Lord. Too often times when we're afraid, we don't do anything because we're afraid that we might do something wrong. Our faith in becoming unsinkable requires us to reach out to the Lord. It requires us to walk in faith. It requires us sometimes to go against our very own natural gut instincts and to trust in the spiritual attitude of this light momentary affliction is working for me. And I need to do the next right thing in faith. There's plenty to be afraid of in Noah's time. There was plenty to be afraid of for Peter. Jeremiah did not live a very good life compared to what we have right now. There's plenty to be afraid of in all the situations of life. But our God asks us to live by faith. He asks us to do what we are told. The question is, will we? To overcome our fears, to set out and to trust in the Lord, and to do what we're told, even when there's plenty to be afraid of, is part of the idea of becoming unsinkable. We won't be unsinkable without a mindfulness to read what God has told His faithful to do. We won't be unsinkable without acknowledging His presence in prayer. We won't become unsinkable by taking our own path, following ourselves, going it alone, being mad at the world, spending all our time trying to figure out why. We won't become unsinkable until we trust in the Lord. Every life has its ups and downs. And it's imperative that we understand this. To be unsinkable, we need Jesus. To be unsinkable means to trust in Jesus and understand that He has made a way for us. If we try to go it alone, if we try to follow our own path, we might tread water for a little while, but sure enough, we will sink. We must follow Jesus in order to be an overcomer. And we must understand that even Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 3, talks about how Noah overcame. He says, there is something similar which saves us, namely baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but an answer of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Baptism saves us like Noah's ark saves us. Baptism is the way that God has told us to come in contact with His forgiveness and grace. How we answer God is not by saying a prayer on our bed. How we answer God is not making up our own rules. How we answer to God is in faith we cry out to God to save us. And let that overcoming of the water be like the overcoming of the blood of Christ in forgiving us. Our salvation is there for the taking. God has provided a way for us to be prepared even in the midst of the storm. Even before the storm, our God has made us unsinkable, if we'll understand. I keep thinking about Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 24, about a storm that our Lord told us about. Whoever hears these words of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rains descended and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. Now everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rains descended, the flood came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Now it's interesting to me that he ends on a negative here. Whoever hears these words of mine and practices them is someone who builds his house ready for the storm. Whoever knows what Jesus says and does not do them, disregards them, tries to figure out a way around them, is like someone who may have a house, they may have a dwelling place, they may have a life, but that life will fall apart. If not now, certainly in the judgment. Don't call Him Lord without planning on doing what He said. Because if we'll trust in His presence, if we'll understand His thoughts, if we'll understand what He wants us to do and then do them, we can become unsinkable in our faith. Thank you. Now, a couple of announcements here at the end of this time. This is the first in a series of lessons. The plan is that we're going to have 2 videos a week. That's the plan. One's going to be more devotional, perhaps maybe a little bit more like this. The other will be a straight Bible study. Right now, my plan is to go through some messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. They will both be available on the website, the YouTube channel, and be linked to on Facebook. There are also ideas afoot about having an interactive Bible study. If there are any sorts of requests, make them known to me, email, text, Facebook, however, and we'll try to do what we can. Thank you.